Among the casualties of the Vietnam War, a significant number were the North Vietnamese and Vietcong soldiers who were captured and tortured by the U.S. soldiers or the American-backed Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The estimated number of captured soldiers reaches approximately 300,000, each of whom experienced horrific conditions while in detention. These prisoners were confined in military-run detention facilities that were notorious for their brutality and harsh treatment. The primary aim of this captivity was not only to neutralize potential threats, but also to extract valuable intelligence or force confessions that could be used to gain an advantage in the ongoing conflict. The facilities that housed these detainees were often overcrowded, poorly maintained, and designed to break the spirits of those held within. Conditions were a far cry from international expectations of humane treatment for prisoners of war. The brutality employed by captors often involved not only physical torture, but psychological torment that left deep, lasting scars on the victims. The war created an environment where ethical considerations about the treatment of prisoners were set aside in the pursuit of military objectives. The physical abuse suffered by prisoners, including beating, starvation, and extreme isolation, while the psychological methods were equally grueling. Prisoners were often left in solitary confinement for days or even weeks, forced to endure the constant threat of violence and degradation. These experiences left many prisoners with irreversible physical and emotional scars, and some never fully recovered from the trauma inflicted upon them. The Geneva Conventions, signed by the United States, explicitly prohibited the torture and inhumane treatment of prisoners. Yet reports from survivors and investigations into these detention centers revealed widespread violations of these laws. Some of the most infamous detention facilities used to house North Vietnamese and Vietcong prisoners during the Vietnam War included Coconut Tree Prison, Phu Quoc Prison, and Con Son Prison. These facilities were notorious not just for the sheer number of prisoners held, but for the extreme brutality that prisoners were subjected to within their walls. Coconut Tree Prison was the largest of all the detention centers, and at its peak, it held up to 40,000 detainees. The prison was situated in a remote area, surrounded by dense vegetation and guarded by a massive security system. The prison's perimeter was surrounded by 15 layers of barbed wire, which created a nearly impenetrable barrier. The treatment inside the prison was particularly brutal for senior communist officials, who were often housed in specialized sections designed to keep them under constant surveillance. These individuals faced harsher conditions than regular soldiers, often subjected to even more violent forms of torture. Phu Quoc and Con Son prisons are perhaps the most infamous due to their use of tiger cages. These were small, cramped cells made of metal or bamboo, intentionally designed to be claustrophobic and inhumane. The cells were extremely hot, with no ventilation, making them unbearable during the sweltering Vietnamese summers. The treatment of prisoners in these facilities went far beyond simple confinement. Prisoners were subjected to a wide range of brutal torture techniques, each designed to break their bodies and minds. One of the most common forms of physical torture was the deliberate breaking of bones. Prisoners' limbs were often broken, and in some cases, bones were rebroken multiple times to prolong the agony. The use of crude tools and methods to break bones meant that the process was not only painful, but also extremely dangerous. Guards would suspend prisoners by their arms, sometimes for hours or even days, causing intense pain and often leading to permanent joint damage or dislocations. The trauma caused by these practices was immense, and many prisoners were left unable to walk or even perform basic tasks after their release. Dental torture was another widely reported technique, where prisoners' teeth were forcibly removed or shattered with crude instruments. This practice was not only physically painful, but also dehumanizing. Many detainees lost their teeth in this way, which left permanent marks on their appearance and added to the trauma they endured. Psychological torment was equally pervasive in these facilities. Prisoners were often subjected to prolonged isolation in dark, cramped cells where they were denied contact with others or any form of mental stimulation. The extreme isolation was intended to break down their mental fortitude and leave them vulnerable to further manipulation. Public displays of torture were also common, where prisoners were brutalized in front of others as a way to instill fear and obedience among the general population. Forced labor was another pervasive tactic used to degrade and weaken prisoners. Detainees were often subjected to backbreaking work in dangerous conditions, all while being given minimal food and water. The physical strain of the labor, combined with the insufficient nutrition, left many prisoners emaciated and prone to illness. The constant threat of punishment for failing to meet quotas or completing tasks was ever present, creating a climate of constant fear and desperation. Launched in 1967 as a covert operation, the Phoenix Program was a key component of the United States effort to weaken the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. The primary objective was to dismantle the political infrastructure of the Viet Cong by targeting individuals suspected of aiding the communist forces, particularly through logistical support, information dissemination, or sympathizing with the enemy. Officially, the program's aim was to neutralize these individuals, a euphemistic term that masked the brutal and often deadly nature of its execution. While the program's stated purpose was to cripple the Viet Cong's ability to wage war, it quickly became one of the most controversial and ethically dubious aspects of the conflict. Over the 5 years it was operational, the Phoenix Program claimed responsibility for the neutralization of 81,740 individuals, including arrests, detentions, interrogations, and, notably, assassinations. The staggering number of deaths attributed to the program, alongside the ruthless tactics employed, led to widespread accusations that it crossed the line into war crimes. The program was a multifaceted operation that involved a complex network of military, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies. It was overseen by the Central Intelligence Agency, with input from military personnel and the South Vietnamese government. The program was designed to infiltrate, destabilize, and ultimately eliminate the Viet Cong's political and administrative machinery. The program relied heavily on a combination of brutal tactics to extract information and intimidate potential threats. At the core of the operation were interrogation techniques that were designed to break the will of the detainees and force them to provide intelligence about Viet Cong operations. These methods, however, were not limited to traditional means of questioning and often involved severe physical and psychological torture. One of the most notorious forms of torture used in the program was electrocution, colloquially referred to as the Bell telephone hour. It involved the use of car batteries to administer electric shocks to prisoners in highly sensitive areas of their bodies, such as their tongues, genitals, and ears. This form of torture inflicted excruciating pain, often causing long-term physical and psychological damage to the detainees. Sexual violence was another pervasive tactic used to break prisoners. Detainees were often subjected to assault with inhumane objects, including clubs, snakes, and eels, designed to degrade and humiliate them. Another harrowing technique involved placing prisoners in small confined spaces with venomous creatures, such as snakes or scorpions. This method was intended to instill fear-driven compliance, as the threat of death or serious injury was constant. Mock executions, in which prisoners were made to believe they were about to be killed, were common. In some cases, prisoners were blindfolded, bound, and forced to kneel before being subjected to the sounds of gunfire, only to be spared at the last moment. This tactic was designed to break the spirit of detainees, rendering them too frightened and disoriented to resist interrogation. In addition to mock executions, threats were often made against the families of prisoners, further intensifying the psychological abuse. Assassinations were another cornerstone of the Phoenix Program. While the U.S. and South Vietnamese governments justified these killings as necessary measures to eliminate Viet Cong sympathizers and supporters, the methods used were often highly questionable. Informants, many of whom were coerced or incentivized by financial rewards, played a crucial role in identifying individuals to be targeted for assassination. Now, these informants were often unreliable, and the information they provided was not always accurate. In many cases, individuals were falsely accused of being Viet Cong operatives or sympathizers, leading to the deaths of innocent civilians. The system of informants was rife with abuses. Informants, driven by personal grudges, were often known to falsely accuse individuals in order to settle personal scores or gain favor with the authorities. This resulted in entire families being targeted when specific individuals could not be located. The brutality of this system reached its apex in several massacres, where innocent people were killed as part of the efforts to eliminate Viet Cong sympathizers. Assassination squads, often made up of CIA-trained operatives, conducted these killings with little oversight or accountability. These squads were tasked with eliminating suspects quickly and efficiently, and they operated with a high degree of autonomy. The indiscriminate nature of the assassinations led to widespread outrage, both within Vietnam and internationally. Reports of innocent civilians being killed in the name of counterinsurgency sparked public protests, and many questioned whether the Phoenix program was achieving its stated objectives or simply contributing to a cycle of violence that further destabilized the region. By 1972, as the political pressure mounted and evidence of systemic abuses continued to surface, the Phoenix program was officially terminated. Agent Orange, a chemical defoliant developed and produced by Monsanto and Dow Chemical, was introduced as a strategic weapon to alter the landscape of Vietnam. The primary objective was to strip the dense forest cover that provided concealment to the Viet Cong forces and disrupt their tactical operations. Beyond military purposes, Agent Orange also targeted agricultural regions, aiming to destroy crops and cut off food supplies for both combatants and civilians suspected of aiding the communist effort. This dual-purpose strategy was intended to weaken the enemy both militarily and economically, but it came with devastating consequences for the environment and the people of Vietnam. The United States military deployed over 80 million liters of Agent Orange between 1962 and 1971, spraying it across more than 20,000 square kilometers of Vietnam's forest and farmlands. This extensive use led to catastrophic ecological destruction. Entire ecosystems were obliterated as the chemical decimated vast stretches of mangroves, forests, and biodiversity. Trees and plants withered and died, while wildlife that depended on these habitats either perished or fled. The environmental damage was so profound that it rendered many areas uninhabitable and permanently altered the landscape, leaving scars that persisted decades after the war's conclusion. The exposure to Agent Orange had devastating and immediate effects on those who came in contact with it. Soldiers, both American and Vietnamese, experienced a significant increase in the risk of developing cancers such as leukemia, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and prostate cancer. Many Vietnamese civilians exposed to the chemical reported acute health issues, including severe skin disorders like chloracne, respiratory problems, and neurological impairments. Villagers living in areas heavily sprayed often found their water sources and food supplies contaminated, leading to widespread illness and malnutrition. The toxic effects of Agent Orange did not end with those directly exposed. They extended across generations. Children of exposed parents frequently suffered from debilitating birth defects, such as missing limbs, spina bifida, cleft palates, and underdeveloped organs. Severe cases included infants born without eyes or with hydrocephalus, a condition causing abnormal swelling of the head. These congenital disabilities were linked to dioxin, a highly toxic component of Agent Orange. Studies estimate that around 3 million Vietnamese individuals, including children and grandchildren of those initially exposed, continue to live with its repercussions. This ongoing crisis has placed immense economic and social burdens on Vietnamese society, with families often unable to afford the specialized care required. Moreover, the stigma associated with these conditions has marginalized many affected individuals, exasperating their struggles and deepening societal scars. Despite their official neutrality during the Vietnam War, Laos and Cambodia became critical battlegrounds due to their geographic proximity to Vietnam and the strategic importance of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This extensive network of roads and footpaths allowed the Vietnamese Army and Vietcong to transport troops, weapons, and supplies into South Vietnam. The United States viewed the use of these countries as a direct threat, justifying their decision to conduct clandestine and overt bombing operations. This effectively drew Laos and Cambodia into the broader conflict, violating their neutral status and sparking significant controversy on the international stage. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States carried out several extensive bombing campaigns under the codenames Operation Barrel Roll, Freedom Deal, and Menu. These operations were aimed at destroying supply lines, disrupting enemy movement, and undermining North Vietnamese capabilities. During this period, over 2.7 million tons of ordnance were dropped on Laos alone, making it the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. In Cambodia, similar bombings targeted areas suspected of harboring Viet Cong sanctuaries, resulting in the devastation of vast swaths of countryside. These bombing campaigns led to staggering human losses, with estimates ranging from 250,000 to 350,000 deaths and over 400,000 individuals wounded. Nearly 1 million people were displaced from their homes, creating a massive humanitarian crisis. The overwhelming majority of the casualties were civilians, as entire villages were obliterated under relentless bombing raids. A devastating consequence of the extensive bombing was the failure of approximately 30% of the bombs to detonate, resulting in Laos and Cambodia being littered with unexploded ordnance. These remnants of war continue to pose a deadly threat, particularly to rural populations who often encounter them when farming or scavenging. Since the end of the conflict, over 20,000 people in Laos alone have lost their lives to UXO, with children disproportionately affected due to their curiosity and lack of awareness. The continued presence of these unexploded devices has rendered many areas hazardous, trapping communities in a cycle of fear and danger. The contamination of farmland with UXO has significantly hampered economic recovery in the region. Millions of acres of arable land remain unusable, directly impacting agricultural productivity and exacerbating poverty in rural areas. Additionally, the destruction of infrastructure during the bombing campaigns left many communities isolated and without access to essential services. The combination of unproductive land, a decimated infrastructure, and the constant threat of UXO has perpetuated economic hardship, leaving the affected regions among the poorest in the world. Free fire zones were areas designated as enemy-held territories, allowing American soldiers to deploy unrestricted firepower. This classification assumed that anyone present in these zones was an enemy combatant. The lack of thorough verification often resulted in the indiscriminate targeting of civilians and enemy combatants alike. The policy fostered a brutal environment, with no distinction made between armed threats and innocuous civilians trying to survive in these areas. Military directives explicitly encouraged soldiers to treat anything that moved within these zones as a legitimate threat. This carte blanche to engage without strict oversight led to a systematic pattern of civilian harm. The zones became synonymous with the normalization of violence. Academic studies and war analysis estimate that approximately 1/3 of those killed in action during the Vietnam War were civilians. This statistic underscores the deadly impact of indiscriminate strategies like free fire zones. Entire families, including women and children, were caught in the crossfire, with many victims receiving no acknowledgement or justice for the loss of their lives. The massacre at My Lai stands as one of the darkest episodes of the Vietnam War, where soldiers were briefed to anticipate only Viet Cong combatants, as it was alleged that all non-combatants would have fled. But this assumption was unverified and flawed. Over several hours, American soldiers carried out systematic executions of civilians, including vulnerable groups such as women, children, and the elderly. The brutality extended to the use of grenades to destroy wells. shooting those attempting to escape, and committing acts of sexual violence against women and girls as young as 10. Villages were razed to the ground, crops deliberately destroyed, and water supplies contaminated to ensure total devastation. The final death toll of the My Lai massacre reached 347 civilians, though some accounts estimate even higher numbers. Despite the scale of atrocity, accountability was minimal. Lieutenant William Cowley, the sole individual convicted, initially received a life sentence. However, his punishment was swiftly reduced to just 3 years of house arrest, sparking widespread criticism of the military justice system. The Vietnam War left deep scars on both soldiers and civilians. Organizations continued to work towards addressing the consequences of the war. Efforts include demining unexploded ordnance, providing medical care to victims of Agent Orange, and advocating for veterans and civilians who have endured psychological and physical harm. While these initiatives offer hope, they also highlight the enduring shadow cast by the Vietnam War on individuals and nations alike.